Welcome, I'm Francis Vigent, and thanks for joining me for this webinar on how to maximize effectiveness by making science learning visible. We have a packed 45 minutes ahead of us, so if you're on the live session, you could submit questions by clicking the orange arrow to show the question panel on your screen. Otherwise, if you're attending through audio only or are not in the live session, feel free to email us, and we'll do our best to respond to your questions individually. So here's the agenda for today. We want to take a look at 5 big areas that are key to understanding both what it means to make science learning visible, as well as how to maximize that, particularly in the context of the new next generation science standards for both adoptive states and adaptive states. So adaptive would be examples like Iowa and California, and adoptive states would be more like Arkansas and so on. So quick rundown, what it means to make science learning visible, connecting with the purpose of the next generation science standards, teaching and learning within the framework of formative assessment, and visibility in the components of the next generation science lesson. Okay, so these are common areas to look at within your lesson structure. And number 5, concrete takeaways for your instruction. Now, the focus of our discussion today will be K-12. There are on the line both users of NoAtom, curriculum and materials, and so on. So much of this will be familiar to them. We also have lots of non-users, folks who are either using other solutions or who have created something of their own, and that's fine. You'll see some parallels here. Feel free to ask questions as we go along. So jumping right into what it means to make science learning visible. One of the issues with this term visible is that many people make the mistake that visible means visual. So the 2 images you see on your screen right now are examples of making learning visual, sort of your classic demonstration, teacher showing students something with a model, okay? Takes a concept and makes it something you can see visually. KWL chart on the right takes something that might be in your mind or a discussion and creates it into a graphic organizer, hence, a visual or a piece of chart paper that's visual on the board. Now, making learning visible really has, maybe there could be elements of something being visual in there, but really its connection is to insight. So visible learning gives students and teachers insight into thinking and skills. So what you see up here in the top left is just a screenshot. The image credits here are all NoAtom and Lawrence Public Schools in particular. But nonetheless, this first top image is a student having a discussion with his lab partners. And what they're talking about is their ideas about how they are going to test friction on different surfaces. And so they have designed this model, they've planned it, and now they're carrying out that plan. And they're making decisions all the way along. Now, he's discussing with his partners, key, so taking his ideas and bringing them out and getting insight into his thinking by bouncing it off peers. But you can picture a teacher here as well. So the student actually could be having this discussion with a teacher present, so that discussion, peer-to-peer, would be giving the teacher insight into the student's thinking and skills also. And when I'm talking about skills, what I'm talking about specifically are science and engineering practices. In the next image, which you see over here, you have a teacher and 2 students who have been planning an investigation, but they're coming to a checkpoint. And they're telling the teacher what their ideas are, what they're going to be doing. And the teacher's acting as an interested skeptic. And that is giving kind of twofold. It's giving the students insight into whether or not they're meeting the expectations of the teacher. They're getting feedback on their ideas and their thinking through that process. And they're better understanding what it means to learn well, so they can take that feedback and go back and implement it right away and sharpen their skills. On the flip side, for the teacher, it's helping that teacher understand where each of those students are at, how they're acting as a team, and also in terms of the pedagogy that's been applied here in this environment, whether or not the students are extracting what's necessary in terms of, are the expectations clear? Do they really understand the purpose of what they're doing? And so on. And then, of course, down the bottom, you have a student who has created a prototype and is testing it. It's a little hard to see. There's a fan off to the side here. But nonetheless, as a result of the student's planning, he's created something, he's testing it. And the purpose of that is to give him insight into his plan, what he thought would work or what wouldn't, the data that he gathered, and then also as he's applying skills and trying to meet the expectations of being an engineer in this case, what that really looks like in terms of the phenomena itself. So in real life, it's hard to see it. This is a windmill. When wind passes across those blades, what happens? Okay. Now, in this environment, students actually carrying out their investigations hands-on gives the teacher insight into where that student's sort of thinking is, but also their ability to apply vocabulary, talk about, and they would do that as they're talking about and describing what's happening, but also their understanding of scientific and engineering processes. So how do they approach this problem when it doesn't function perfectly or the way they expected the first time? Okay, so all of these are showing snippets into students' thinking and skills, and in such a way that as a teacher, you can be extracting value for yourself in your instruction and helping to better meet those students' needs and also to better direct, redirect, and differentiate instruction. Okay, so moving ahead here, why is this important? Well, it has to do with the purpose of next generation science standards. Their purpose is really to prepare students to participate in innovation. And what that means is not necessarily to be a scientist or engineer with a PhD in, physics, but really to be able to take disciplinary ideas. That's why we call them disciplinary core ideas, and to be able to see relationships between those disciplinary core ideas. And so that's the cross-cutting concept dimension. And not just be able to connect ideas and how they behave, but actually to be able to develop and use those ideas in order to solve problems and answer questions that we may have as citizens. And so that's where the practices come in, the skills. So the standards themselves are a performance expectation, but the purpose of making science visible and really creating lots of opportunities to gain insight as a teacher and also simultaneously as a student, it's getting insight into these three areas: the skills, the concepts, and the system's behavior that relates to those concepts. And that serves the purpose of helping the student reach a mastery level in their ability to demonstrate an understanding of the standards. So that's why they're considered performance expectations and not standards, even though we always call them standards. Okay, so maybe a little bit too much information if you're already well versed in the next generation science standards, but the reason this is important and why the visual, getting insight and making learning visible and not visual is that it's all about higher order thinking. Okay, so in order to be able to use concepts, to develop them and use them in order to solve problems and answer questions, it means creating, evaluating, and analyzing simultaneously. Okay, so that is that's really the higher order thinking that's required by those science and engineering practices, and it's not required. It's required of the teacher by virtue of being a professional teacher. It's the onus of the learning here, the thinking, is on the students. So as a student in a next generation classroom, I need to be creating, evaluating, and analyzing simultaneously. Otherwise, it's pretty much impossible for me to be engaged in the practices of science and engineering. And unfortunately, traditional instruction really focuses on those lower order thinking skills, which tends to be around what would be closest to the disciplinary core idea dimension in remembering and understanding facts and occasionally applying them. But those are all lower order thinking skills. So I'm starting to kind of hint at this, but there's models of instruction, some that maximize effectiveness when it comes to making learning visible in a science classroom, and there are others which tend to obscure learning, and therefore it's not visible, and therefore it's hard as a teacher to inform our instruction, and then as a student to inform our learning, and for each party to sort of tweak and adjust to get closer to excellence. And so in traditional instruction, we talk a lot about a focus on summative assessment. So what is summative assessment? Basically, it's high stakes, infrequent. It tends to focus on binary facts. And so you get this comparison of student work, answers to something that's either right or wrong. And part of this is, over time, has sort of developed because we've had fact-based standards in the past. They haven't necessarily involved skills at the level that they're involved today. And so this sort of focus on binary facts comes from the old standards, but it's this right-wrong answer piece is how, under older standards, that we could get easy grades. The student knows the fact or they don't. And then in order to sort of progress through that sort of a model where students hear facts, see facts, and then recall them to demonstrate their proficiency, requires a very teacher-centered approach. So summative assessment really is, when you look down this list, teacher-centered, sort of binary recall sort of model. Formative assessment is essentially the opposite. It's low stakes, it's frequent, and some people would call this informal. Types of assessment can fall into this, but not all informal assessments are formative, nor are they frequent. The key to formative assessment, so formative is the opposite of summative, is that it informs the teacher about the student's response to the teacher's practices. So it's informing the teacher about what it means to teach well. A lot of people forget about the next piece, though, that it also needs to inform the student about the learning expectations and what it means to learn well. So a learning expectation does not mean a standard on your board. A learning expectation means how do I as a student perform in this class in such a way that I'm meeting your expectations and the expectations of mastery. And so that may mean, an example of this would be something like, students who are engaged in a lab partnership, conducting themselves as scientists and engineers and actually thinking together and comparing ideas and compromising. And so the work that they're producing when they go to a checkpoint with their teacher is showing evidence of collaboration. It's showing that both, and when you sort of play the role as teacher of interested skeptic, what that does is it shows you that both parties contributed to this in a meaningful way. They actually both own it, okay? So as a student, when I go to a checkpoint, I understand that that's the expectation, and so I can sort of defend my thinking, okay? I can explain why we're taking this approach, not that I'm coming up with something and I want you to tell me if it's okay. The idea of bringing something up and getting an okay or a check, okay, move on, right or wrong, that's the old model that I just showed you, that summative assessment. Formative assessment is also performance-based. You need a really rich context. You need a full release of responsibility. We'll talk through a bit more of these things later. But the thing is that it's not a binary right-wrong type grade. What it is it gives you a performance spectrum. And so I think this is where a lot of folks with moving away from sort of the ABC grades to the 1 to 4 or 1 to 5, this is sort of the underpinning spirit of that, is that performance is on a spectrum. And so you can really see that spectrum in this type of environment where you can't, with these summative sort of binary assessment techniques that worked under previous standards. They don't work under the new standards because students don't develop skills overnight. They're not a binary sort of thing. It's much more like, I would assume a pilot. A pilot who can fly a small two-seater airplane versus a commercial airplane versus a fighter jet or an acrobatic sort of entertainment aircraft or something like this. Everybody is performing a similar task, but in a different way. And depending on how that task is being performed, we may be able to view their skills as perhaps more advanced or less advanced, depending on what's required in the moment. So this is very student-centered, okay, as opposed to what we talked about previously, sort of the worksheet, fill in the blank, why did you learn this? Why is this important to know? Type right, wrong judgments that are done under summative assessment. So I want to look at it maybe at a very high level, the difference between a traditional summative classroom and the next generation sort of formative classroom. So a traditional classroom functions with this idea. So picture this as a graph, okay, and that there's an expected outcome for a task. So, if a student, does something, they're going to end up with some particular outcome. And so the hope is that you see everybody falling on the line of what you expected, right? So under traditional models of instruction in science, the idea is that if all students produce the correct outcome, they're all proficient, we can all move on. Now, what that means is anybody who doesn't produce what's expected, well, they must be wrong. And everybody who produces what was expected, well, they must be right. So this is back to that sort of summative model of assessment, right? The summative traditional classroom. The goal is to get everybody to have the right answer, to fall on the line, and then we move on. That traditional model usually looks like content flowing through a sort of teacher or specialist who explains and demonstrates, and the students then recall, summarize, and repeat, right? So that makes sense. Recall, summarize, and repeat the right things I told you, you end up there. And if you don't, you're somewhere off of there, so you must be the wrong one. Try to figure out how to fix you. Now, a next generation classroom looks like this, where there's not necessarily an expected outcome, but there's kind of general boundaries that are out here somewhere. And the goal is not to necessarily push students to have all the same answers on the same line, a particular outcome, but instead to look at these different data points that we get, and maybe I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit. Picture this as teams of students who are trying to solve similar problems or questions, okay? If they're trying to solve similar problems or questions and they come up with different data, let's say, it doesn't all fall in a linear expectation, then it's incumbent on the students, and this is the type of next generation inquiry environment that the classroom should represent, to begin thinking about why these different data points occurred. Why did different approaches get the same output, right? For two different X's, why did we get essentially the same Y? So if you're a high school or middle school teacher, that's like a limiting reagent type reaction or something like this. At an elementary level, the bottom line is that students could be mixing, vinegar and baking soda, but why is it that at some point, if you mix more vinegar in, you don't get any more bubbles? Okay. Now, you might look at the data, students look at the data and might also be asking things like, how is there a relationship? Maybe there is really a line there, okay? And these are all clustered around that line, okay? And these two happen to be right on it. So in a next generation science classroom, the idea is not about getting all students to give a specific answer the way it is in a traditional summative classroom environment, but instead to use what students are doing in the classroom as a foundation to explore phenomena, to answer questions and solve problems about that phenomena, and to discover the relationship between different students' approaches to questions and problems amongst each other. So to begin creating sort of a peer-to-peer environment where teachers acting as coach. So I like to think of that environment as a place where we discover what influences results, so that every one of those data points that a team, their conclusions, let's say, that those teams make in your classroom are an opportunity for the teams to question themselves and to question other teams, and as myself as a teacher, to create a discussion about, why are you all up here, but a bunch of people are way down here, and so on, over here and up here. Were there choices that certain groups made that placed them up here and other teams didn't make and placed them someplace else? Okay, and this is much more realistic, and that's my point, is that here, student experimentation and learning serves a purpose. Its purpose is to investigate phenomena, to better understand it. And specifically in a next generation model of instruction, what it's doing is it's putting students into a position where they have to attempt to practice specific, science and engineering skills, specific science and engineering practices, and to use those skills to develop and use the disciplinary core ideas and the cross-cutting concepts. So a teacher is not getting in between the students and the content. The teacher's acting as a coach and helping the student to understand the expectations and to help refine the student's practices, and to act as that interested skeptic that's helping the students kind of challenge their thinking around the content and the way that content behaves. Okay, that's how in a next generation inquiry environment, these science and engineering practices, which I have up here at a high level, the 8 next generation science and engineering practices, are mastered by students. Okay, so bringing this back to kind of visibility, essentially what we're talking about here is creating an environment and opportunity for students to get insight into these different practices, to actually get an opportunity to engage in the practice, and then to get feedback from the teacher, which they can then use to better understand where they're at, they being the student, and also to improve the quality of their own performance in the moment. Okay, so that's why when I mentioned earlier that the practices are important to understand as something that the students need to develop and be able to demonstrate independently, and to do so in conjunction with, different practices. So not one practice at a time, but actually a student should be skilled in combining different practices in order to achieve a great appropriate goal. The student needs to be able to ask questions or develop a model, plan an investigation, analyze data, and all this independently. Okay, engage in argument and do so from evidence. So you can imagine in an environment where students are, obtaining that evidence, planning those investigations, analyzing them, coming to conclusions, which they then have to kind of look across their peer group and say, wait a minute, is the way I ask this question or approach this problem, dramatically impacting my results because, my group and their group just does not agree, and there must be some fundamental reason for this. So thinking about using this in the classroom as a practitioner, which format really allows those practices to develop within students? Is it summative or formative? You probably already know. I'm going to say, it's a formative environment, but what's really the difference? This is sort of my contrast, that summative environments are very directed. They're a high control environment. So, teachers are stopping and starting the students. You need to do this now, and then wait, and then we're going to do this next, and giving students all the procedures and all the steps and all that sort of stuff. That's high teacher control. That's also, by virtue of being high teacher control, very low student independence. If the teacher's acting as the one who's saying that's right, that's wrong, you need to fix this, and so on, that's again summing up where a student's at, and it's putting students into a mode where they are learning to comply with adults, or they're learning to comply with people who know things that they don't. And that's really, I think, a very dangerous thing to do, because really, students need to learn how to be empowered and how to use their thinking as a tool for their own empowerment. And so if students are merely learning to comply or remember or arrive at one outcome, or to do something and let somebody else judge it, without considering their own sort of expectations of what they believe they should be doing in order to achieve their goal, then students are not being set up for long-term success with skills that are going to serve them well, when it comes to a career. And I don't care if they go to tech school, college, higher education, or they just, start a company with the money they have when they graduate high school. The bottom line is that a formative environment is one where students have a space to be independent. The teacher's acting as a coach. They're helping students to reflect on their own work. And every one of these, you see basically the opposite, right, of a summative environment. And the key is that the feedback that students are getting in a formative environment and that teachers are able to collect by virtue of those interactions, whether it's formal or informal, it's changing teaching and learning in the very moment that it's happening. If I have 3 teams of students check in with me as they're creating a lab, and I see that they're all misunderstanding something that was a key expectation, then that's a quarter of my class or a third of my class. You know what? I'm going to do a quick pause and a group redirect, because that tells me that my pedagogical approach to setting those expectations was ineffective for some reason when that happened. Okay, so formative assessment is about that. And for students, the idea that the critique that I get and the feedback that I get is actually useful is also very important. So, how many people have seen students sort of drop, they get a grade and they drop something in their desk or their locker and they really don't look at it, especially if you've made, comments on that work. They kind of just toss it over there. Why? Well, because the student believes that, the grade is done and the learning's over and they got what they got. So they're going to have to try again next time. Whereas in the moment, getting formative feedback when it's low stakes and frequent, student develops the expectation that they can take that feedback right now, go do something with it, and that's going to improve their grade, their performance, and their outcomes, in the next few minutes or the next day. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is just look at 5 parts of a next generation lesson and sort of approach this from the perspective of, 1, its purpose, 2, how it makes science learning visible if you use that tool the right way. So the first one is nonfiction reading. So nonfiction reading is very common. However, the purpose of nonfiction reading in the science classroom is really to explore concepts, to really get a first look at anchor phenomena, let's say. It doesn't mean it's the only way that you access. It really shouldn't be the only way that you access anchor phenomena, but it's a first look. The idea of taking content and images off of a page and thinking about them together and trying to consider what it implies about our life, or perhaps an author's perspective, or perhaps about different aspects of the environment if it's related to the environment. So the purpose of nonfiction reading is to get students to step into the content, okay, and to consider it. Now, the visibility that the student gets out of that is a context for those words, images, and scenarios around the anchor phenomena, and the different types of connections that we often see when we talk about English language arts or reading, concept to concept, concept to self, concept to world. And key to all of this is some questions and dissatisfaction with what I know as a student. So an example of how this may not happen and how nonfiction reading can obscure visibility is when students read silently. Okay, if students have to come to your class in order to read because you can't trust them to do it at home, okay, maybe that's a good use of time on learning, but it's not a good use of time on learning if it obscures what we just talked about here. If it obscures the opportunity to step into that context, okay? And so reading silently does that. There are reasons to do it within reading programs, but the key here is that we want to get those connections off the page and out in front of students and out in front of the class as fast as possible. From a teacher standpoint, this gives us visibility into where students might have some prior experience or none, what level of sophistication they have with ideas and the vocabulary in particular, and where there might be some misconceptions or where connections may be made that are essentially inappropriate, not in a sort of a punitive sense, but just, for example, not all matter is living. Okay, atoms are not living, but atoms can make up living things. So if you were to read about matter in a nonfiction reading piece, that might be something that comes up. Now, if students are reading silently and there's nobody sort of interjecting questions into that, then how would you ever know? Okay, in that case, the learning, the thinking is invisible. And finally, you get a really good look at what the kids find interesting. And that's really key because that interest is also what will engage and motivate them as your lesson progresses. So think about this as the first insight for teachers into student thinking about phenomena. The second thing, which we often include in next generation lessons, and in the no atom model, it's always there, is Socratic dialogue. So the purpose of Socratic dialogue is to get students to take those ideas and questions that came up during reading and get them out. Get them out in front of other students in an environment where students can connect their ideas to other people's ideas, and to also give insight around why they think what they think, to try to offer support for it, and to also allow their questions and thinking to evolve. Okay, so Socratic dialogue is not something that's really teacher-led. Teacher may coach it. They may have higher order questions that act like lily pads to help, that they will interject here or there to transition students from one big idea to the next if the discussion sort of dies. But I dropped some Socratic dialogue sentence starters into the handout section for you. And I'd like you to take a look at those at some point. I'll just drag them over so you can see. But what we encourage folks to do is to teach students how to engage in Socratic talk. Okay, and these questions are appropriate, tweaks on them can be appropriate all the way down to kindergarten, but certainly once students are able to read, pretty much all the way on up, these questions are appropriate. So similar to accountable talk, students learn how to challenge assumptions, express opinion, build on other people's ideas, support views, whether they're theirs or somebody else's, or to help their peers to clarify understanding. And the point in these Socratic sentence starters, or using them to teach students Socratic talk, is that you want Socratic dialogue to be a group discussion that makes all students sort of thinking their ideas something that they bring out of themselves and they put before others for consideration. Okay. Now, what does a student get out of this? Well, a student gets insight into a bunch of these key areas. One, that other people think the way they do. Two, that people actually disagree with them. They may think entirely opposing things, and so on. That there are ideas and ways to connect what I was thinking that I didn't even consider, and I'm learning that by hearing the connections and ideas of other people. The other thing is that Socratic dialogue it's building on that reading component, right? In the reading, we're just trying to get through the reading, but maybe stopping at some key points. When we get into Socratic dialogue, that's when all the questions come forward, because it's really an open forum. And so in the first sort of lesson segment, questions persisted. When you think about Socratic dialogue as almost like a second segment here, questions are going to continue to persist. Not all questions are going to have answers. And so those questions or the problems that are identified become the basis for science and for engineering. And that's what scientists and engineers do. They actually plan experiments or prototypes, and they carry those out. They gather data, and they use that data to decide whether or not their approach answered a question or solved a problem. So these are all things that are really important for students to engage in, so that they get those practice skills, particularly things like arguing from evidence and so on, forming models, asking questions. And this is where it starts, okay? And there are key things. Taking risks and making mistakes are acceptable. And when this starts early on, when I say early on, not just within a school year, but starting in kindergarten or pre-K, what happens is you get more resilient middle schoolers, because some communities will have helicopter parents, other communities have absentee parents and helicopter teachers. The problem is that we can have these fragile, perfect children that realize that they don't know it all, but are afraid to make a mistake or a risk, and they have not been equipped to essentially understand reality, that not everybody falls on that line, that in fact everybody's all over the place. So we need to have methods for just determining fact from opinion and using the evidence that we can gather and the knowledge that we have. From a teacher's point of view, this is where we're informing our instruction with trends in student thinking, where phenomena resonates with the kids, the individual and group misconceptions that are out there, how effective our pedagogy is when it's applied to the nonfiction reading. So an example of this would be in a Socratic dialogue, students may bring up things, either statements of opinion or questions which show that they don't fully understand a concept, which is fine, except that they may be arriving at some sort of a false conclusion. So, for example, is language a learned trait or inherited, or a learned characteristic, or is it an inherited trait? And so, students may say, "Oh, well, dogs bark, and my dog barked, even though it wasn't around any other dogs, and so therefore, barking is inherited, and." Because we make noise by speaking instead of barking, language is inherited. And I've seen this sort of discussion actually happen literally in a classroom, where then a student will chime in and say, well, actually, I think that communicating in an auditory manner or verbally is inherited, and the ability to do that is inherited, but how you communicate verbally, whether it's in Spanish or French or English or barking or whatever, is something that is learned. And so, that in and of itself is an example of how Socratic dialogue in this sort of peer-to-peer iron sharpens iron environment can dispel misconceptions, but also empower students and teachers to better understand thinking. So if you think about a class and how, the big picture of how a lesson can unfold, this is a model we often use in No Adam, where starting with nonfiction reading, having Socratic dialogue, not all those questions or problems are answered there. So that becomes the basis for students to plan their investigations, which they'll then carry out and use the data to form a conclusion and debrief. Well, many people don't want students to engage in planning. They feel like, and I actually, even in Socratic dialogue, I've had people tell me, oh, we don't do Socratic dialogue because it's a total waste of my time. People, just make up questions and answers and, like it's totally not worth it. If that's what your Socratic dialogue consists of, just making up questions and answers, then I would agree it's probably not worth it. But a Socratic dialogue's purpose is to actually inform the participants about their own ideas, using the views and ideas and knowledge of other participants. Not all of those things are answered or solved, so that is the foundation for using a scientific or engineering process and applying those science and engineering practices and developing and using the content in order to attempt performance of the standard. So that's where this is now coming back to these next generation science standards in terms of their actual mastery. The purpose of students planning their investigations from a skill standpoint, students need a full release of responsibility. They're learning to self-regulate. They're learning to follow a question or problem to an evidence-based conclusion. And they're also learning to collaborate and to achieve a grade level appropriate goal. They are understanding, so again, where this sort of formative environment comes into play. Students are using the feedback that they're being given about their plans in order to improve their skills and performance. And so from a student standpoint, they learn and see literally that the feedback's useful. It's not just a grade, but it's actually useful. And that the teacher's role is not just to give a right or wrong sort of stamp on something, but to actually push the students to think, and it's the student's job to think, okay, and to change and to respond and to react. And if they don't, then the student owns the results no matter what, okay? Students learn really simple but important lessons like what you say and what you think can be interpreted in many different ways. And so the choices in the wording that you use can broaden or narrow your results or even your approach to a question. From a teacher's perspective, this communicates through a checkpoint process. If a student is creating a plan and coming to checkpoints, it helps teacher understand how clear their expectations are from a student's point of view, how effective they were at coaching the Socratic dialogue. Did the students really transition through all those big ideas? Did they really make key connections that were either obvious or necessary in order to progress? What's the quality of the kind of formative feedback I'm giving to students? Are they responding appropriately to that, or is the feedback not useful? Because that's very common. Giving quality feedback is an art, especially to do so informally, on the fly kind of. Students are going to be on a spectrum of higher order thinking, so this gives visibility into that. How deeply are students thinking into the problem or question as they're planning? Are students thinking sort of all in one area? Are they basing their ideas on misconceptions? And how willing are individual students to contribute and to collaborate and compromise with each other? Because a key aspect of all this is teamwork. So again, in that environment, all of these science and engineering practices are being pulled on and sharpened, okay? So it's like riding a bike. Students need to get on and they need to try, and this formative feedback sort of environment is all about making students' thinking visible to the student and making it visible to the teacher so that both are gaining insight into how well the student and the teacher are, developing practices. Think of it that way. So the purpose of students carrying out their investigation. So people tend to be fine with students doing things hands-on, but the problem is that they tend to use hands-on investigations as more of a nice to have, a culminating activity, or sort of as a cap to a unit. We learned all about this, and now because we did that, we can do this hands-on thing. That doesn't really mean anything unless students are carrying out something that they intellectually created and that they are having to engage in those science and engineering practices in order to produce it. Okay, and this is where you run into problems with sort of cookbook labs where students are given everything, the teacher controls sort of the flow of everything, and students become more focused on not spilling something because they feel like that is the real goal, instead of really being engaged in understanding how what they're doing is developing their own understanding of the anchor phenomena. Okay, so think of the purpose as students created something, and now they're going to see the fruit of that creation, and does it match their expectations? And whatever the result of that creation is, they're going to need to take it and use it in order to form a conclusion, and it's going to involve some reflection. Okay. This also has this level of authenticity, right? If you are allowing students to carry out investigations that they planned, then you have this opportunity to have authentic results, which are all over the place. And then as a result of that, students are able to make those kind of comparisons about, well, why is your data different than mine? What's influencing the outcomes? And so, they're asking the question, why do we differ, sort of to themselves, but also to each other as we get towards that debrief. Okay. So the visibility students get is insight into the real phenomena, which is observational phenomena, a little thread of the anchor that sort of everybody started talking about and thinking about in the beginning. They learn, and these are some really key things, they learn that when they create a plan but they fail to follow it, the data is no good most often. And sort of technically, it's no good because you can't reproduce it. That how a plan gets interpreted influences results, and that by thinking through things in advance, we can anticipate future challenges and sometimes eliminate challenges. And that being organized and efficient and using precision can help with producing, when you have precision organization in a plan, and then you follow that plan with precision and organization, you have more reliable results. So that's key. And then one other piece is that just because you collected data doesn't mean that it's data that's useful for answering the question or solving the problem, which is something that is a key realization, which I think many adults take for granted. But from a student's perspective, it's something that we need to encounter and learn. So this, hands-on experimentation, if it's carried out appropriately, teachers learn how well the students have internalized the science and engineering practices. They also understand that, where are the trends in data going? How do I want to actually construct my debrief? And what sort of areas do I want to focus on? Where are the students at on that spectrum of sort of student scientist, student engineer versus student who is the product of a traditional learning environment, isn't expecting me, and they're expecting me to tell them what's right and what's wrong. Okay. The last piece here, and I'm going to jump into sort of the key takeaways in a moment. The last piece is really around the purpose of debrief and transition. So think about students I've gone through. They've carried out some hands-on experiment that they planned, they created, they gathered some data, they formed some conclusions. Well, debriefing is not just, hey, what did we learn? Did we like that? Was that fun? Great, clean everything up. What it's about is another sort of Socratic, in a way, opportunity for students to look at the root of differences between their data and other teams, to take what they observed and to reflect all the way back to the anchor phenomena, and to think about how individual choices the teams made influence their outcomes, or maybe how they could have tried to approach the problem or question more, differently. And then it acts as a springboard for the teacher, at least if it's a well-articulated curriculum and resources, to jump right into the next lesson, because well-articulated curriculum and resources are scaffolded in all three dimensions. they really shouldn't adapt. And this is one I think the big misnomers that's out there. If many classrooms function in a traditional model, if you have truly well-articulated next-generation curriculum and resources, they will not adapt well to traditional teaching practices. They shouldn't really adapt at all if they're well-designed. So if you have curriculum that is, purported or does adapt to traditional techniques, then that's a problem, because that means that by design, it's not creating the space and supports for students to be scientists and engineers, to actually engage in those higher order thinking skills. And it is not scaffolding across all three dimensions appropriately in such a way that it's going to get students to mastery of those performance expectations. So, keep it in mind. What students are going to take away from a debrief and transition is really some validation, but on a different level. Validation around risk-taking, that it can produce positive outcomes, that mistakes happen, that it's not all about right and wrong. That feedback isn't personal, okay? Just because I get feedback on something doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It doesn't mean I have bad ideas. It just means that there's opportunity for improvement, that everybody's ideas are valuable, and that we can all learn from each other, and we can build on each other's thinking, so we're somewhat stronger together than we are independently. That data actually plays an important role in supporting or refuting an argument and telling fact from fiction. And also that the idea that there's such thing as life science, earth science, physical science, sort of in isolation, is an artificial construct, that all of the skills and concepts are actually deeply interconnected, to the point where it's very hard, if you think as a scientist or engineer, to see things like earth and life science as being separate, because they are creating each other's existence. Without the characteristics of the geology and temperature and so on Earth, we wouldn't be able to have life. And yet living things are made up of non-living components like atoms. So, there's a lot of sort of sharing and overlap here. So students get visibility on that through this whole process, but the debrief is what drives it home. From a teacher standpoint, they really get a sense, or we get a sense of the effectiveness of the pedagogy in our lesson. So we are able to begin answering the question for ourselves: do students really connect with why they asked that question or problem? Can the student actually articulate how they came to their own conclusion? Can the student reflect on what influenced their outcomes? Because you can imagine a classroom getting to the end of a lesson, and you say, well, the child goes home and the parent says, well, what did you do? And I made this, and they pick up something they made. Say, well, why did you make that? How did you come to the conclusion that that's what you wanted to make? Or, did everybody make the same thing? And, if you can imagine a parent asking those sort of questions of a student, and if a student just sort of shrugs their shoulders and they're like, well, yeah, I don't know. It's a fair answer if they really don't know. And the thing is that that's an indicator that the instruction's inadequate. And if you flip that around, and if all of what a student is, coming to at the conclusion of a lesson is a product of their own thinking, which was made visible to them and to the teacher, and both were adjusting their approach to a goal or series of goals along the way, then students can emerge able to answer these kind of questions. And that's what makes for long-term retention and mastery across three dimensions, and the student's ability to independently perform the expectations of the standards themselves. So these are really key pieces of informing instruction. It also helps us to understand as we move forward, again, if we have a well-articulated lessons and curriculum, these areas of strength and weakness within students and within a group that we want to focus on as we move forward, applying the science and engineering practices again to new content and phenomena. And also this acts as that momentum, right? We want momentum August through June or September to May or however your school year looks. Okay, we don't want to stop at sort of the textbook awareness, knowledge ready, or I guess it would be more like museum visit awareness, textbook knowledge, sort of kit practice, task performance. But what we want are students who are prepared to develop and use what they know in order to answer any question or any problem they encounter. So the key takeaways here is reading. Make students' insights visible by making reading a team effort. Take turns reading, student, teacher, student. Don't linger too long. Get that reading out of the way, because remember, its purpose is just to get students to step into that content and begin thinking about it. And at key points, interject with questions to model and encourage higher order thinking. The next thing we discussed is that Socratic Dialogue makes students' thinking visible by creating a forum and teaching students how to use Socratic talk to get insight into the connections that they are making personally, and also to lend their insight to other students. Keys for this: teach students the Socratic questioning techniques. I shared with you the questions there. The role of the teacher is to act as moderator, not the questioner in chief. Okay, it's not if as a teacher goes in and I have all my questions that I ask and the students answer them, and then we move on. That's not a Socratic dialogue. Okay, Socratic dialogue is multilateral, not unilateral. Use Socratic dialogue as a way of raising questions and problems that students will be able to experiment and prototype with. Okay, that's its purpose. It lays the foundation for planning experiments or investigations. Planning investigations, the purpose here, remember, is it makes students thinking visible by teaching them how to logically apply science and engineering practices to answer questions and solve problems. Okay, the logic really comes from science and engineering processes. We're not getting into that today. It's a webinar on its own. And people have a lot of misunderstanding about what a process is versus what old school scientific method versus new school scientific method and all that sort of stuff. But nonetheless, the planning of investigations the first thing you have to do is actually let them plan. A lot of people don't want to do that. They feel like it takes too much time. Well, building skills takes time. Keep that in mind. Also, people don't tend to like that there's variation among teams. Why? Because in a traditional model, remember, everyone's trying to get the kids to fall on that line. Well, allow the variation, allow the scatter plot. Teach and use science and engineering processes as the way for students to take the practices and sort of apply them logically. Use it as a framework, okay? And lastly, use checkpoints where students have to meet specific expectations and get feedback from you as the teacher, okay? So students shouldn't be acting independently without regular and frequent accountability, okay? That doesn't mean you stop the whole class. What that means is that, your expectation is that students are going to meet, come to a specific point, and then they're going to come to you. Teach them to self-regulate. Number 4, and then the last takeaway, and I'll take some questions if we have a couple minutes here. Carrying out the investigations. Remember that you can make students approach visible by requiring students to own their thinking and results. That means you as teacher are playing the role of interested skeptic. Require students to follow their own plans, to discuss their own work, and to accept that the student's data is going to vary. Let them own that data and explain it, use it in their conclusion, and then remember, you're going to come to a debrief. So if the kids are way off the rails here or there, they're going to self-correct, okay? And that regardless of mistakes, students should use their data to reflect on their thinking and their approaches, okay? So it's not about right and wrong as much as what can we learn from this? Where do I go next, okay? Lastly, debrief and transitions. make science and engineering visible. Okay, so it's not just about learning, but it's actually the discipline itself. Make science and engineering visible by creating a class forum for students to explore the root of any differences. Okay, differences in their outcomes, in their approaches, in their data. And the keys here are to make sure that during that debrief and transition that there is connection back to the anchor phenomena. You know, debrief and transitions are groupthink. You know, it's the only things when I think of the next generation environment, the planning, the experimenting, the ideas, those are all sort of team and individual. But the reading, the Socratic dialogue, and the debriefing, that's all groupthink. Okay, because that's where we can learn from each other more than just one person, but actually as an entire group. Helps create an important focus. So explore why the team made the choices, or different teams made different choices, and how that affected outcomes, and do so as a group. And explore what that means as it relates to the problem or question that everyone was sort of pursuing, and also what it means in relation to the phenomena that we initially stepped into when we were reading and having our Socratic dialogue. Does this better help us understand forest fires? Does this better help us understand flooding? Or, you know, is this a way of building a bridge that's stronger, potentially, than perhaps a bridge that we learned about that wasn't strong? So these are things that you can do in your class today, no matter what resource you're using. The problem becomes, and I'm happy to take questions, the problem becomes when the sort of environment that is created in the classroom does not allow for formative assessment. It doesn't allow for full release of responsibility, student independence, collaboration. The content is not rich enough because people are trying to pursue one standard at a time and not teaching standards in clusters. They're not following an integrated model with these new standards where students are able to see and interact with multiple standards at one time. That's all really key. So I'll leave it there and take some questions, but I guess my closing message to you here is simply that you can't expect anything of students that one, you do not give them the expectation that they can achieve it, and number two, you don't give them the space and the support to be able to achieve it. And support doesn't mean taking away the challenge. Support means acting as a partner in the process. So I'm going to grab the questions now. Okay, so there's some questions around around grading. So grades are, so it depends on how we think about grades. So the question here is, does a grade in science answer the question, how well does the student learn, or how well does the student demonstrate the performance expectations? So if I understand the question properly, essentially the question here is a grade a judgment of how well a student learns or how well a student performs? And I guess what I would say is it's very, this is kind of a tricky, this is a tricky question to answer because in a summative grading environment, when people take a summative approach, the grade really is a reflection of how well a student does two things. One, remembers, and two, understands the teacher's question or the question at hand. Okay, so if a student understands a question at hand well and remembers well in a summative environment, a student should be able to perform well. Now, in a formative environment, a grade is reflective of many, many more things. It's reflective of the student's skill level when it comes to science and engineering practices. It reflects also their level of understanding and their ability to create and evaluate and apply the disciplinary core ideas, and how well they're able to make connections between the way the different disciplinary core ideas behave in sort of a systems manner. So something like inputs and outputs, stability and change. Are they able to form relationships between content and the way that it behaves? You know, if I increase the amount of wood in the fire, I increase the amount of heat output from that fire. So, or I guess it'd be total thermal output. But nonetheless, so my point here is that there's another part of a question in here that is sort of maybe conflating things that I don't think should be conflated, is that grades are not necessarily high stakes or low stakes. I think that comes from how we use grades. It's sort of like a sword. You know, a sword can be deadly, or a sword can be a decoration. It really depends on how you use it. And so I think grades become deadly when they are purely high stakes and they're infrequent and they're summative in nature, and they are only reflective of a student's ability to understand the teacher's question and remember the answer to that question. What's really unfortunate about that is that it's in that environment, it's also the student's grade is also a reflection of the teacher's skill at questioning, and also their skill at presenting things in a way that they can be remembered. So, that's my thought on that. The low stakes test grading is really, it's really about trying to get a density of observations where we get a more accurate picture of what a student's level of mastery is of those three areas and their ability to perform the expectation of the standard. So, so in that sense, I would agree with the person asking this question that, it is more, grades should be more about whether a student is able to demonstrate performance of the expectations of the standard. But nonetheless. Okay, two more questions. So one question having to do with the resources themselves. So yes, you can take a look at what this looks like from a teacher's point of view. If you go to knowAtom.com and you click on curriculum, you can see for your state, how we articulate lessons to help teachers, be able to conduct a full year of this type of instruction. And the last question here has to do with reading and English language learners. So big piece here with reading and English language learners. If you have students who are not proficient in English language, don't make them read. I mean, they don't have to read in science. You might say your principal's making you do it. Well, that's a discussion between you and your principal. But at the end of the day, within a science context, reading only serves a purpose to present some ideas and to help students have a context to be able to step into. Okay, if a student is not able to read at grade level, apply strategies to take that reading off of the page. Read it aloud. Okay, that's the most obvious. There's many other, tools, Kurzweil readers and other things like this. If your state allows for reading in a student's native language and the student is literate in that language, there's no problem with doing that either. But, it's important to not let science be defined by reading, because reading science is not learning science. Science is recorded in writing most oftentimes, but otherwise science is all about developing and using the skills that scientists and engineers use and need in order to develop and use content, solve problems, answer questions, and to do so by forming those evidence-based conclusions. So with that said, I apologize. I appreciate your hanging on. I know there's some other questions. Feel free to reach out. My contact information is here, and be happy to try to answer those for you. Wish you all well, and good luck in making the most of science time on learning under these new standards and maximizing your effectiveness by making science learning visible. Again, my name is Francis Vigent. Thank you, and good day.